Hey guys, so this is going to be a short video about Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapters 1 and 2. Um, so we're reading this book, which we're going to read, not the whole thing, but the vast majority of it. Part of your work for the next 6 weeks is to really get a sense of the whole breadth of his argument. If you took my ethics class, you guys did the same thing with Aristotle's ethics. It was worth watching how he carefully builds his argument from one book to the next, so you really get a sense of the power of just how far you can go if you keep building on your previous argument. The metaphysics, however, is different. Its structure is a little bit more convoluted. I think you'll find that a lot of the times, instead of straightforwardly building on what comes before, he seems to start again from slightly different premises and really try to consider alternate options for the same sorts of questions. So it definitely requires more paying attention just a little bit than the ethics. So let's start with the first paragraph of Book 1. I think a fair summary of this opening is that he's trying to ground the pursuit of the kind of knowledge that metaphysics offers by trying to show that it's the point of being human, and it's the completion of our human attempt to know. This is going to be slightly different from the way that he characterizes ethics for a lot, human knowing and human activity in a lot of the ethics. So it's a real question as you go through this book, what exactly is the point of metaphysics, and can it give us the kind of knowledge that it promises? And once we get that knowledge, is it worth anything? He seems to go almost back and forth on this point. So take a look at the very first paragraph in Book 1. Sachs' translation is the one that I'm going to use, and it's the one that we're going to be using for the semester. I strongly recommend getting the same translation because it's going to be very, very different and really hard to understand if you're not following along with his vocabulary. So he starts by saying, all human beings by nature desire to know. The sign of this is our love of the senses. For even apart from their use, they are loved on their own account, and above all the rest, the one through the eyes. For not only in order that we might act, but even when we are not going to act at all, we prefer seeing, one might say, as against everything else. And the cause of this is that among the senses, this one most of all makes us discover things and makes evident many differences. So in these opening lines, Aristotle's really summarizing the point of much of what comes next in the next two chapters. So think about the first line. In Sachs it says, all human beings by nature stretch themselves out towards knowing. A shorter way of saying this is, all human beings by nature desire to know. So this is interesting. We have talked about Aristotle's views on nature. We talked about how Aquinas uses them to complete his argument about things that are beyond nature. But here at the beginning of the metaphysics, we're just back to this basic claim about nature. Only this time we're talking about specifically about what human nature is, something that can't be otherwise, that is always or for the most part. It looks like human beings desire by nature to know, and somehow this becomes one of the most important elements of what it means to be human for the rest of this book. So human beings can be defined by a lot of different sorts of relationships in Aristotle. Sometimes it's our relationship to the political community, and sometimes it's our relationship to simply talking / reason alone. But this is special. Somehow what we desire is knowledge in a strong sense, episteme, not just messing around, but what Thomas called scientific knowing, what he called a science. So, all right, so Aristotle gives us a reason why this is true, why all human beings desire to know. A sign of this is our love of the senses, because we love the sight most, not so that we might act, but simply we enjoy seeing. So in the ethics, it looked as though action was the point of being a human. We had to get out in the arena and actually make choices and complete actions, human actions. But Aristotle's saying, like, okay, but we really just love to see. It bothers us when our eyes are closed. We like to just look at a landscape, look at a painting, look at another person, really just look at anything, look at a wall. We prefer it if we can. And we're doing it not because we're gathering data, although we are. We're not doing it because we're getting something out of it. We're doing it just because we love it for its own sake. And that is a sign of the fact that, biologically speaking, human beings simply just love to know. Why do we love sight? Not for what we get out of it or how we can act from it, but because we love the knowledge that comes to us through sight. He talks about different animals, and how their different senses seem to affect their intelligence. Sight seems to do something to our intelligence. Sight plus memory seem to allow us to learn in a way that other animals can interact with things through intelligence, and some animals do learn some things. But as animals, the combination of our sight and with memory, the ability to remember much longer than many different sorts of species, this is what allows us to start to learn. So we slowly progress towards the completion of ourselves as biological organisms with these special characteristics that we alone have. So take a look now at the second paragraph. Experience, he says, human beings seem to get experience from memory. So many memories build up over time and bring to completion a capacity for one experience. Experience is an important word for him. You can check it out in the glossary in this book. Let's see what his examples he uses first before we try to define it. He says, experience seems to be almost the same thing as knowledge or art. But for human beings, knowledge and art result from experience. For experience makes art, as Polis says, but inexperience makes chance. And art comes into being whenever, out of many conceptions from experience, one universal judgment arises about those that are similar. So here in chapter 1, you get this strange relationship between three different human phenomena. Experience, art, and knowledge. So remember, knowledge in the strong sense, real knowledge that can give you a demonstration, not just like vague opinion or belief. But then also art, which, check the glossary. We've talked about this before. We saw this in Plato. It's almost like artisanship, like craftsmanship. It's not art in the sense of a sort of intuitive knowing with a flair, like as an artiste, but real solid ability to make something real out of something else. Carpentry is an art for Aristotle. Plumbing is an art. Weaving is an art. So we're contrasting really solid knowledge, really real art or craftsmanship with this experience. So we tend to use experience in a very general way, and when we use it to mean describe a lot of things about our basic human impressions and the things that happen to us. Here, if you can think of it as something, a real almost a habit that arises from many memories of something. It's a real connection to some aspect of our way of living. You have experience if you have experience working with metal, or if you have experience working with string. You know what it's like to hold metal, you know how heavy it is, you have a sense of when it breaks and when it doesn't, and you have a sense about like wind string, what different kinds of string can make. But you know it through experience from a lot of memories from working with these materials for a long time. But so now we have to figure out the difference between art and experience. So he says, art comes into being via one universal judgment that arises from those that are similar. And then he gives an example of whatever this one universal judgment would be. For to have a judgment that this thing was beneficial to Callias when he was sick with this disease, and to Socrates, and one by one, in this way, to many people, belongs to experience. But the judgment that it was beneficial to all such people, marked out as being of one kind, when they were sick with this disease, such as to sluggish or irritable people when they were feverish with heat, belongs to art. So this is a great example. You, as just an ordinary human, not a doctor, you don't possess the skill or art of doctoring. You can think about what was good for one person when they were sick. Your mom when she was sick, or your brother when they were sick, or the kind of knowledge that your mom has when you were sick. Do they have enough experience to make universal judgments about the art? Sometimes, but the crucial distinction between people who have experience and who have art are those who have seen what happens for individual people, but have seen enough that they're capable of making one actually true universal judgment that pulls all that together. And then it changes in kind. Because I'm not just saying, oh, well, that was good for that person. Then I say, well, all those kind of people who are sluggish or irritable, they reacted with a fever in a certain way. These people who were sluggish, they could rest in bed easily. The people who were irritable could not. So you have to treat them differently. And that's the skill of doctoring, or maybe at this point what we would call nursing. How do you get the sick person to heal? Now he says, for the purpose of acting, experience doesn't seem to differ from art at all. And when we see people with experience being more successful than those who have a rational account without experience. So this is really important because he's about to say some things that sound very reductive about manual labor and about craftsmen and people who just work with their hands, work with materials. But this is a crucial distinction because he says that when people are acting, it seems as though their experience, which arises out of memory, is often just better from people who have some kind of rational account, which is to say, who seem to have some kind of knowledge. You could explain this by saying that some people are simply better nurses who've never been to nursing school because they have enough experience of how to take care of people when they're sick. Whereas somebody who's read a textbook about nursing is not necessarily going to be able to apply their knowledge of the principles of nursing to the individual sick person. So he's really admitting in a very strong way that knowledge, real knowledge, and even real art sometimes has trouble with the particulars. It has a trouble with the things that come from people who don't have learning. So he's making a sort of he's acknowledging this very familiar problem that book learning does not always allow you to act. So keep that in mind. So, okay, next paragraph. Now we're on page 2 at 981, A24 or 25-ish. He says, nevertheless, we think that knowing and understanding are present in art more than in inexperience. And we take the possessors of arts to be wiser than people with experience, as though in every instance, wisdom is more something resulting from and following along with knowing. And this is because the ones know the cause while the others do not. So this is great. And for my metaphysics students this semester, we've talked a lot about cause. And this is sort of an early mention of cause here. And it should be a huge red flag for you. Because before we were talking about cause as simply sort of an isolated way of analyzing the world. But right here, Aristotle's giving almost like an anthropology or a sociology of different ways that human beings know. And he's trying to sort of locate who knows the cause, what value it has, and who we honor and respect based on whether or not they have a knowledge of the cause. So we seem to believe that knowledge and understanding belongs more to people with art than people with experience, even though we know that experience often doesn't differ from art at all. So here, in my reading of this particular passage, he seems to be moving from a straightforward delineation of knowledge, art, and experience to trying to talk about how people think about it. Like, how do people usually honor and respect different kinds of vague ways of knowing in the world? So that's really different. So everything that follows right now is about what he thinks generally opinions people generally have. So we have to ask ourselves if those match up our opinions or not, and who really has the opinions that he's talking about. So, okay, sometimes we'll say some people believe that people with art have more knowledge and understanding than people simply with experience. So why? Because the artisan knows the cause. Let's think of a good example for this. So like if you are spinning and spinning is very difficult and you have to take this like fluff of wool and sort of like piece it apart into a fine thread. So people with experience can do this very well. Like it's actually, it relies a lot on your intuition of just how you have to move your fingers, how slippery the wool is. But people who have a craftsman's knowledge of it would be able to explain why certain kinds of wool were easier to spin than others. This hardest kind of wool to spin is something really slippery like Angora or flax. So in my example here, we'll say that the person with experience simply knows, simply through what they've seen with their senses and felt with their hands, that Angora is harder than camel's wool, which is quite thick and greasy, which makes it easier to hold in your hands. It doesn't fly through them. But the artisan, the master craftsman, is the person who has thought hard about the different kinds of wool, what makes one easier to spin. And so has that something almost like knowledge, grouped by kind, not by individual instance of particular, about what's going on. And in that example, you can really see like, it's really not hard to have spinning by art. It'd be really hard actually to not be able to simply observe what the difference was between those two things and not come up with a kind of cause. But that's the difference. The people with experience know the what, but they don't know the why. And the others are acquainted with the why and the cause. Okay. For this reason, we also think the master craftsmen in each kind of work, these craftsmen are more honorable and know more than the manual laborers, and are also wiser, because they know the causes of the things they do. As though people are wiser, not as a result of being skilled at action, but as a result of themselves having the reasoned account of knowing the causes. So here he's really playing on your willingness to think that this is what the majority of people really do honor. We honor, he says, we think this as though these people were not skilled. So he's leaving it open whether or not the manual labor actually is skilled or not. But so in our most political hierarchies, and this is true of us no less than ancient Greece, we tend to give respect to the person that we call the master craftsman, like the doctor over the nurse, or the building, like what do you call the guy who's in charge of all the people who are building the building, rather than the people who are doing the building themselves. We tend to pay the master craftsman more, or the doctor more, and so we're ourselves saying, well, why do we do that? Why do we give these people more honor? It's because we believe them to have more knowledge. Part of what happens with this example is that you have to be picturing a perfect society where the person who really did have the most knowledge really was in charge. Like he's already sort of like trying to like push you almost to a Plato's Republic situation where you are in the hierarchy is your merit, but not just your merit in terms of pure experience, skill, whatever, but actual knowledge. Is he correct to say that that's how we divide up the community, why we do give greater honor to these people? That's an open question. I think it might sort of be. In a way, you could say, even if it's not actually true, the nurse often knows more about doctoring than the doctor, and sometimes the manual labor knows things that the architect just completely misses. Why? Because they have more experience, and maybe actually art as well. But so we have to picture like, it almost seems as though political hierarchies represent an imperfect image of our desire to know as humans that we all share. And so if I even just see someone who kind of halfway looks like they have more knowledge, I respect them, even if I'm wrong about my judgment, even if I'm using knowledge without actually experience particulars. But so at the end of that paragraph, he does give you a slightly better reason how you could judge who's really got knowledge or not. A sign of the one who knows and the one who does not is being able to teach. And for this reason, we regard the art more than the experience to be knowledge, since the ones can, but the others cannot teach. What a broad question there. But in general, you could say like, if I only knew something purely by instinct and having done it a fair amount of times, or even if I knew it a fair amount of times but hadn't like really thought about why I knew it or how to explain it to people, for now we'll go ahead and say that the ability to teach makes you fully aware of what causes are at work at each step, in a way that if you had just left it up to you, you probably would not have sorry, I just realized I have to stir, I have to turn the heat off on the rice. If you're teaching, if you just left a lot of stuff intuitive, you would not have been able to really actually understand it. All right, almost done with chapter 1. Okay, so he's going through continuing reasons why, in his anthropology of, why he wants to convince you that metaphysics is the completion of our human ability and desire to know. We're going to go through a couple of other reasons. Further, he says, and now I'm at 981 B10, the bottom of page 2, in the sex. Further, we consider none of the senses to be wisdom, even though they are the most authoritative ways of knowing particulars. They do not pick out the why of anything, such as why fire is hot, but only that it is hot. It's a nice Hume reference to the Hume that we read last week. Hume was claiming that you could never understand the causality of the heat as coming from the flame for skeptical reasons. We just piece together the fact that we see those two things together and we claim that the one causes the other. So Aristotle's sort of halfway on board. Our senses tell us some things. They tell us the fire is hot. So that's a stronger claim than Hume is making. But the senses alone don't tell us the why. The senses contain the why, but it's through articulate speech, through the logos, that we piece together what is present already fully in our senses. So, okay, we tend to talk about, we still want the cause. So it's likely that the one who first discovered any art, whatever that was beyond the common perceptions, was wondered at by people, not only on account of there being something useful in his discoveries, but as someone wise and distinguished from other people. Okay, so this is a great myth about when the first art is discovered. But so impressive is art, and so different is art or craftsmanship from our pure perception of things, that if I can imagine like the first person who really put something together about nursing people through an illness, or how metal bends, like the bronze bent in a certain way that I could use it for a weapon, I would consider that person as wise and distinguished. He's playing off our human like desire to give honor to something that is worthy of honor. And it does seem like a reasonable myth. It would just be impressive, the first person who figured out how to make a thread, or the first person who figured out how to make an arrow. But then things change. First, we have these like sort of manual laborers and we respect them, these manual artisans. But once more arts have been discovered, and some seem directed towards necessities, but others toward a way of living, it's likely that such people, as were discoverers of the latter kind, that is, those who directed art towards a way of living rather than just what's necessary, that these people were always considered wiser because their knowledge was not directed towards use. So he just sort of throws that in there, and that'll be like a big part of what happens in the second chapter. But slowly we stop respecting the most necessary arts, such as cooking or making arrowheads or building buildings. But we start to respect these other arts. Why? For whatever psychological reason, we seem to respect knowledge he claims that is useless in some kind of important way. He says, for instance, the mathematical arts came about because the people who came up with them in ancient Egypt didn't have to do anything necessary. They had the leisure to sort of come up with something that wasn't obviously of immediate use. Was it useful in some other further way? Yes, but not quite in the same way as building a building or weaving a cloak. So our sort of hierarchy of what counts as the best kinds of knowledge is changing as like political hierarchy starts to complicate itself. In Egypt, the priests were the honored people because of their leisure and the useless knowledge that they came up with. Last paragraph of chapter 1. Now it's been said in the writings on ethics what the difference is among art, demonstrative knowledge, and the other things of a similar kind. But the purpose for which we are now making this argument is that all people assume that what is called wisdom is concerned with first causes and origins. Therefore, as was said above, the person with experience seems wiser than those who have any perception whatever. The artisan seems wiser than those with experience. The master craftsman seems wiser than the manual laborer, and the contemplative arts more so than the productive ones. It's apparent then that wisdom is a knowledge concerned with sources and causes. It's a strange argument. It almost, but not quite, I feel like immediately explains why, like where these sources and causes come from. We saw most clearly, I think, that when the person with the real art and not just experience seemed to understand something, we honor them because they knew the cause. I think that's a solid argument. The master craftsman, etc., that's a little bit harder. But I love that line, the way that Sachs translates it, just 2 lines above 981b30. He's like, look, but the purpose for which we're now making this argument is that all people assume that what is called wisdom is concerned with first sources and origins. So, okay, I think he's giving you a sense of why, rhetorically speaking, he's trying to make this argument, working from the doxa that he claims that most people have, and what he's trying to convince you of here. We're trying to convince you that what's called wisdom is concerned with first causes and origins. I'll explain more about this eventually. And I think it's fair to say that his argument is on the way towards making that case, but almost not, but we'll see more in chapter 2.